Ever get that feeling like the world's just changing so fast it's hard to keep up? We're surrounded by incredible inventions. But have you ever stopped and thought about where it all started?
It's truly fascinating to think about, isn't it?
I mean, how did we go from using, basic tools to having smartphones and self-driving cars? Today we're going on a journey, a deep dive into the interconnected history of inventions.
Oh, I love that idea. It's really amazing to see how even the simplest inventions can have these ripple effects through time, influencing everything that comes after.
Absolutely. And we're going to be using this super interesting text as our guide today.
Oh, cool.
It basically maps out how inventions have developed all the way from ancient times to the present, and you will be surprised by the connections between things that seem totally unrelated.
It's funny you say that. The connections are definitely there. It's all about seeing how ideas build on each other, like a giant chain reaction of innovation.
Okay, so let's kick things off with the true classic, the wheel.
Oh, a good one.
I know, right? It might seem pretty basic now, but this thing has been around for thousands of years. It practically built civilization as we know it.
The wheel and axle, yep, first popped up in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC. And yeah, initially it was all about transportation, moving things around. But the truly cool part is how its impact went way beyond just getting from point A to point B.
Okay, so not just carts and chariots then.
Exactly. The wheel, think about it, it introduced this whole concept of rotary motion, basically spinning. That led to flywheels for storing energy, pulleys for lifting those heavy objects during construction, water wheels for harnessing the power of rivers, even gears for all sorts of machinery.
So the wheel was like this ancient Swiss Army knife of inventions, but how did it actually change everyday life for people way back then?
Well, it was huge for agriculture and for the growth of cities. I mean, imagine trying to transport tons of grain from farms to cities without wheels. It just wouldn't be practical.
Yeah.
But with efficient transportation, well, now you can support larger populations, cities can expand, and it all sort of takes off from there.
So bigger harvest, more people, bigger cities. The wheel really got things rolling, literally. And that's at the stage for even more incredible inventions. Speaking of which, let's fast forward a bit to the steam engine. Think, billowing smoke, those awesome chugging trains, the whole Industrial Revolution vibe.
The steam engine. It's funny, people actually understood steam power way before they could really put it to use.
Right.
Back in 100 AD, a guy named Hero of Alexandria, he designed this basic steam turbine. He called it the Sphere of Aeolus.
Whoa, that's like super early. So what happened? Did people just not get how big of a deal steam power could be?
I guess not. Hero, he saw the steam turbine as more of a novelty than a powerful tool. It took centuries for the practical applications to catch on. It wasn't until 1712 that Thomas Newcomen built one of the first usable steam engines. And its main job, pumping water out of mines. Super important back then.
Okay, so steam power goes from party trick to a real workhorse. But something tells me the story doesn't end with pumping water.
Oh, you're right about that. This is where James Watt enters the picture. He makes some key improvements to the steam engine, like adding a crank.
A crank? Why was that so important?
Well, because it takes that back and forth motion of the steam engine's piston and converts it into rotary motion, the kind we were talking about earlier.
Ah, now we're cooking. So
Yeah.
steam engines plus rotary motion equals a transportation revolution.
You got it.
Suddenly you've got ships like Robert Fulton's Clermont steaming across the ocean in 1807, and then of course there's the railroad.
Those early railroads, believe it or not, they actually use horses to pull carts along the rails. It wasn't until the steam locomotive came along that things really took off.
It must have blown people's minds to see those iron horses just tearing across the countryside. What was the long-term impact of the railroad, would you say?
It completely transformed how people traveled and how goods were traded. In the 1860s, the Transcontinental Railroad connected the United States from coast to coast. It was a monumental moment. Suddenly, those vast distances weren't so daunting anymore. The railroad opened up all this new territory, it sparked economic growth, and quickly became the main way to move both people and all sorts of stuff.
But people always want to go faster, right? Next up, the automobile.
Absolutely. But get this, even the earliest cars, you know what they ran on? Steam power.
Really?
Yeah. But they were bulky and slow and honestly not very practical. Just picture a steam-powered car trying to keep up with today's traffic.
I'm getting anxiety just thinking about it. So what finally gave us the cars we know and love today?
The internal combustion engine. We can thank guys like Carl Benz working with gasoline and Gottlieb Daimler. They didn't just invent these engines, they kept refining them, making them better and better until they were ready for the world.
That's some serious dedication. And then, of course, you've got Henry Ford, the guy who made cars affordable for pretty much everyone, right?
Absolutely. Ford had this vision of a car for the everyday person, not just for the wealthy. And his Model T, built on an assembly line, changed how cars were made. But here's a fun fact. Ford's inspiration for that very assembly line came from a pretty surprising place.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. What was it?
Chicago slaughterhouses. The way they processed meat on a moving line, breaking down all the work into these smaller tasks, that's what sparked Ford's imagination.
That is a wild connection if I've ever heard one.
It just shows you that invention is all about making connections between things that might seem totally different on the surface.
All right, this is where things get electrifying. Let's talk about electricity. I mean, come on, it's impossible to imagine life without it now. But it all started with some pretty shocking discoveries, and I mean that literally.
It all began with a kite, a key, and a thunderstorm.
Oh yeah, Ben Franklin and his lightning rod.
Exactly. That experiment was a major turning point in our understanding of electricity.
I bet it took some serious guts to fly a kite in a thunderstorm. What was he trying to prove anyway?
He wanted to show that lightning was a form of electricity, and, well, he did. But even more than that, his experiment really challenged this common belief at the time that lightning was like a sign of God's anger.
So Franklin, he tames lightning and sparks a scientific revolution in the process. But how do we go from zapping ourselves with static to having power grids that light up entire cities?
The battery is key here. Alessandro Volta, he created the first real battery. It was called the voltaic pile.
A pile. What was it, like a pile of rocks?
Not quite. It was this stack of copper and zinc discs separated by pieces of cloth that were soaked in salt water.
That doesn't sound very high-tech. How did that produce electricity?
It was all about the chemical reaction
Yeah.
between the metals in that salt water. This setup created an electric current. The battery, it opens up this whole new world for experimenting with electricity, and that paved the way for it.
The telegraph. Now, that's what I call a communication revolution. No more waiting weeks for a letter.
It was amazing. The telegraph let people send messages across incredible distances like the blink of an eye. They used electromagnets and this special code of dots and dashes to send information along wires.
Samuel Morse. He invented the telegraph.
That's the guy. And his very first message, sent in 1844, was, "What hath God wrought?" Pretty fitting for such a groundbreaking moment.
That's a pretty profound first text. So
Right.
how quickly did the telegraph spread?
It was like wildfire. Within just 20 years, telegraph lines were crisscrossing continents. They even laid cables under the ocean to connect Europe and America.
The world was shrinking fast. And then, of course, came the telephone. Now you're bringing the actual human voice into the mix.
Yeah, the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, who was a teacher of the deaf, was completely fascinated by sound. He imagined a speaking telegraph. And in 1876, he makes that first successful phone call.
I'm sure there's a famous first line here. What was it?
Of course. He called out to his assistant, Thomas Watson, and said, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you."
And just like that, communication was changed forever. But did everyone immediately jump on board with the telephone? It seems so essential now.
Well, not exactly. Get this, Western Union, which was like the big Teleton company back then, they actually turned down the chance to buy Bell's telephone patent for a measly $100,000. Can you believe that?
Talk about a missed opportunity. It's hard to even imagine life without phones now. But let's move on to another invention that truly lit up the world. The light bulb.
Ah, yes, the light bulb.
Yeah.
Thomas Edison, with all his relentless experimenting, finally brought us the light bulb in 1879. He tried thousands of different materials before finding the right one for the filament.
It's amazing what persistence can achieve. I mean, can you imagine life before electric light?
It's hard to even fathom, isn't it? The impact of having electric light was immense. People could now work longer hours, businesses could stay open later, entertainment changed, advertising was affected. It wasn't just about illumination. The light bulb laid the foundation for the entire electronics industry.
It literally illuminated the path to a new era. Okay, so now we've got electricity powering communication and lighting up our world. But there was still a problem. Those clunky vacuum tubes, they were bulky and expensive, not to mention unreliable. This is where the mighty transistor enters the scene.
It's 1948. Three guys at Bell Labs, John Mardine, Walter Bratton, and William Shockley, they invent the transistor. And get this, at first, nobody really paid much attention.
Seriously, why not? It seems like such a game changer.
Well, sometimes it takes a while for the true impact of a revolutionary invention to sink in, you know?
Yeah.
But The transistor's ability to amplify electronic signals, all while being smaller, cheaper, and way more reliable than those old vacuum tubes, it was huge.
And the transistor really paved the way for the invention that basically runs everything these days, the computer.
That's right. We've come a long way from those room-sized behemoths like the ENIAC, filled with thousands of vacuum tubes, to the computers we use today, where you can fit millions of transistors onto a single tiny chip.
It's mind-boggling to think about how much computing power we have at our fingertips now. What do you see as the impact of the computer going forward?
Well, the impact is already huge. From our personal lives to the global economy, the computer has changed how we live, how we work, how we communicate. It's even changed how we think. And it's still evolving at an incredible pace.
Speaking of world-changing inventions, let's shift gears for a minute and talk about one that saved countless lives, the microscope.
The microscope. It literally opened up a whole new world, didn't it? Suddenly, we could see all these tiny wonders that had been invisible to us for centuries.
I can only imagine what those early scientists must have felt when they peered through a microscope for the first time and saw bacteria.
Well, it was Galileo who made some key improvements to those early microscopes. And those improvements allowed scientists to finally see bacteria and understand how they were linked to diseases. That was a massive breakthrough.
And then came vaccines. Were microscopes important there too?
Oh, absolutely. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine, for instance, came about through careful observation and the use of microscopes, and Louis Pasteur later built on that work with his rabies vaccine. None of that would have been possible without being able to see those tiny disease-causing microbes.
And then you've got penicillin, another game changer in the fight against infections.
You're right. Penicillin revolutionized medicine. It was discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. But it's funny, Fleming actually kind of lost interest in penicillin for a while, and it took another team of scientists to sort of rediscover it and figure out how to turn it into a usable drug.
That's a good reminder that even the most brilliant minds can sometimes miss the importance of their discoveries. But what about fighting viruses? They're even smaller than bacteria, right?
That's right. Viruses are way too small to see with a regular microscope, and that's where the electron microscope comes in. Instead of using light, it uses the power of electrons to see things at an even tinier scale.
It must have felt like unlocking a secret door to this hidden world.
Exactly. And this breakthrough, it led to more life-saving vaccines for diseases like polio, measles, and mumps. Those vaccines have drastically reduced the incidence of those diseases and saved countless lives.
It's incredible how much progress has been made in the fight against disease, all thanks to the microscope.
It truly shows the power of scientific curiosity and the dedication of inventors, these people who keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But I think it's time we take a break, don't you?
Yes, let's pause here for now. We've covered some truly groundbreaking inventions. Be sure to join us for part 2 of our deep dive into this amazing world of invention. Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of inventions. Last time we were talking about the microscope and its impact on medicine.
Before we jump back in, I was thinking about what you said earlier about how some inventions, they almost seem to, anticipate a need before it even arises.
It's true, like they're a step ahead, almost like they're coming from the future. What do you think drives that kind of visionary thinking?
It's a fascinating mix, really. You need that deep understanding of the existing technologies, but also the willingness to question everything. And honestly, a good dose of luck, or maybe serendipity, plays a part too. I mean, think about the invention of the airplane.
The Wright brothers, those bicycle mechanics who dared to dream of flying.
Exactly. They weren't the first to try to get a machine off the ground, but they really dug deep into the science of aerodynamics. They experimented like crazy with all these different wing designs, and finally, in 1903, boom, sustained, controlled flight.
And they changed the world forever. The sky wasn't the limit anymore. What's so cool is how inventions often build on each other. Didn't the airplane also benefit from all the work that had been done on engines and propellers?
Oh, absolutely. The internal combustion engine, developed for cars, that's what gave those early airplanes the power they needed. And propellers, which had been used on ships for centuries, they were adapted for flight. It's this perfect example of how innovation takes existing technologies and combines them in new and clever ways.
So what's next for flight? Are we going to have those flying cars everyone keeps talking about anytime soon?
The idea's been around forever, right? But it's definitely becoming more realistic thanks to all the advances in things like electric propulsion, autonomous flight systems, and lightweight materials.
I'd be first in line to skip that rush hour traffic. But seriously, what are the hurdles we still need to clear before flying cars become just a normal part of life?
Safety is a big one. We need systems that are rock solid to prevent accidents up in the air and make sure those landings are always safe. Then there's the whole issue of air traffic control. Imagine thousands of personal aircraft all zipping around in our already crowded skies.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. And what about all the noise? I can't imagine a sky full of tiny airplanes would be very peaceful.
Noise pollution is a valid concern, for sure. That's why engineers are busy working on quieter electric propulsion systems. And there are some pretty exciting designs out there for vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, ETOL aircraft, we call them. They can take off and land from rooftops or special landing pads, which would help with both the noise and the space issues.
Okay, so maybe our commutes really will be up in the sky one day. That's pretty mind-blowing. But for now, let's bring things back down to Earth. What are some other areas where you see big changes coming in terms of invention?
Well, renewable energy is a huge one. As we move away from fossil fuels, we need to find cleaner, more sustainable ways to power our world. It's critical.
Things like solar power and wind power.
Exactly. And the technology in those areas is getting better and better all the time. Solar panels are becoming more efficient and less expensive. Wind turbines are getting bigger and more powerful. And we're also exploring some brand new frontiers in energy, like harnessing the power of ocean waves or geothermal energy from deep inside the Earth.
So many possibilities. But making the switch to renewables, that's going to take more than just cool new technology, right?
You're absolutely right. It's going to require a change in how we consume energy, investments in new infrastructure, and policies that really support the development of renewable energy.
It's a huge challenge, no doubt, but it's absolutely essential if we want to create a sustainable future.
I completely agree. And speaking of sustainability, another area that's ripe for innovation is agriculture. We need to figure out how to feed a growing global population without destroying our planet. That's the bottom line.
I've heard a lot about things like vertical farming and lab-grown meat. Are those actually realistic solutions?
Well, vertical farming is pretty interesting. It's essentially growing crops indoors in these stacked layers. It's a way to produce food in urban areas, so you cut down on transportation costs, you use less water. Lab-grown meat, that's another fascinating possibility. It's meat that's cultivated from animal cells in a lab, which could offer a more sustainable and ethical alternative to traditional livestock farming. It's still early days, but the potential is huge.
It sounds like the food we eat in the future could be totally different from what we're used to.
Well, that's the beauty of invention, isn't it? It's this constant cycle of exploration, discovery, and creativity. Who knows what the future holds?
Okay, let's shift gears again. We've talked about inventions that revolutionized communication, transportation, how we access information. But what about the inventions that transformed how we understand the universe itself?
Yes. We can't forget about the telescope.
Those early telescopes, I mean, they were pretty basic, right? What made them so revolutionary?
Well, it's true that those first telescopes were simple, but they allowed astronomers to see things they'd never seen before. And then you have Galileo coming along in the early 1600s, and he makes some key improvements. With his enhanced telescope, he sees mountains on the moon, he discovers 4 of Jupiter's moons, and he even observes the phases of Venus.
I bet those were some pretty amazing sights. But these observations weren't just about pretty pictures, right? They actually challenged the prevailing views of the universe.
Exactly. Back then, most people believed the Earth was at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
But Galileo's observations, they provided compelling evidence for the heliocentric model, which puts the sun at the center of the solar system. It was a huge shift in thinking.
A major paradigm shift, and it basically paved the way for modern astronomy.
It did, and telescopes, they've just kept evolving, becoming more powerful and more sophisticated. Today, we have telescopes that can peer deep into space, revealing distant galaxies, helping us unravel those mysteries of the universe's origins.
It's incredible to think how far we can see into the cosmos now. And we're not just limited to visible light anymore, are we?
You got it. We have radio telescopes now. They detect radio waves coming from space. Those waves can travel through clouds of dust and gas that block visible light, so it gives us a whole new way to study the universe. And then there are space telescopes like Hubble, which orbit above the Earth's atmosphere so they can capture these amazingly sharp images.
It's like we have all these different ways to explore the cosmos, each one revealing new wonders and mysteries.
It's awe-inspiring and a good reminder that we are always learning, always discovering new things. The pursuit of knowledge never really ends.
I love that. Speaking of journeys, we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive. From the simple wheel to the incredible power of the internet, we've seen how human ingenuity has shaped our world in countless ways.
And really, we've only just scratched the surface. The pace of innovation is constantly accelerating. It's exciting to think about what breakthroughs might be just around the corner.
It is exciting, but a little overwhelming too. As we've been talking about, though, invention is not just about creating fancy gadgets. It's about solving problems, making lives better, and building a better future for everyone.
That's such a crucial point, and it really highlights how important it is to cultivate curiosity, creativity, and collaboration. We need to encourage young minds to think outside the box, challenge those assumptions, embrace the power of innovation to build a world where everyone can thrive.
Beautifully said. Okay, to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has inspired you to see the world a little differently, appreciate how interconnected all these inventions are, and really embrace the possibilities that are out there.
The future isn't just something that happens to us, right? It's something we build together through our collective ingenuity and imagination. So get out there, explore, invent, and make your mark on the world.
We've covered a lot in this part, but there's even more to come. Be sure to join us for part 3, where we'll delve even deeper into the forces that drive innovation and what the future of invention might hold. Welcome back to the deep dive. As we've been exploring this amazing world of invention, something that's really struck me is how some inventions, they come about because there's this clear and present need, like someone says, hey, we got to figure out a way to do X, and then bam, an inventor figures it out.
Yeah, I see what you mean. There's definitely a problem-solving element to a lot of inventions, but then you have those other ones.
Yeah.
The ones that almost seem to, anticipate a future we didn't even know we wanted yet.
Yeah, it's like they're a step ahead.
It's like they're time travelers getting these glimpses of what's possible
Yeah.
years before anyone else.
Exactly. So what do you think drives that kind of visionary thinking?
I think it's a mix of things, really. A deep understanding of the tech that's already out there, a willingness to question everything, and then often a good dose of luck, or maybe serendipity. Think about the invention of the airplane, for example.
Oh, yeah. The Wright brothers. Those bicycle mechanics who dared to dream of flying.
Exactly. They weren't the first to try to get a machine off the ground, but they were the ones who really dug into the science of aerodynamics, experimented like crazy with all these different wing designs, and finally, in 1903, they achieved it. Sustained, controlled flight.
And they changed the world forever. Suddenly the sky wasn't the limit anymore. And it's so cool how these inventions build on each other. I mean, didn't the airplane also benefit from all that work that had already been done on engines and propellers?
Absolutely. The internal combustion engine, which was first developed for cars, that's what gave those early airplanes the power they needed. And propellers, well, those had been around for centuries, used on ships, and they were adapted for flight. It's a classic example of innovation, taking existing technologies and putting them together in these new, clever ways.
So what's next for flight? Are we going to have those flying cars everyone's been talking about anytime soon?
The idea of personal flying vehicles, it's been around forever. But it's getting closer and closer to reality, thanks to advances in electric propulsion, autonomous flight systems, all those lightweight materials.
Oh, I would be first in line to skip rush hour traffic. But seriously, what are some of the things we still need to figure out before flying cars become a regular part of our lives?
Safety is the biggest one, I think. We need systems that are incredibly reliable to prevent those mid-air collisions, make sure the landings are always safe. And then there's the whole question of, air traffic control. I mean, imagine thousands of personal aircraft all zipping around in our already crowded skies.
Yeah, it sounds a bit chaotic. And what about all the noise? A sky full of mini airplanes doesn't sound very peaceful.
Yeah, the noise pollution is a real concern. And that's why engineers are working hard on those quieter electric propulsion systems. Plus, there are some interesting designs out there for vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. VTL aircraft, they call them.
VTO, okay.
They could take off and land from rooftops or special landing pads.
Oh, interesting.
So that helps to address both the noise and the space issues.
So maybe our commutes really will be up in the sky one day. That's pretty wild to think about. But for now, let's bring things back down to Earth. What are some other areas where you see, big changes coming, in terms of invention?
Well, renewable energy, that's a big one. I mean, as we move away from fossil fuels, we absolutely need to find those cleaner, more sustainable ways to power our world. It's essential.
Right. Things like solar and wind power.
Exactly. And the good news is the tech in those areas is getting better all the time. Solar panels are getting more and more efficient, cheaper to produce. Wind turbines, they're getting bigger, more powerful. And we're also starting to explore some completely new frontiers when it comes to energy, like harnessing the power of those ocean waves, or geothermal energy from deep inside the Earth.
So many possibilities, but making that shift to renewables, it's going to take a lot more than just cool new tech, won't it?
You're absolutely right. We need to change our energy consumption habits. We need investments in all that new infrastructure, and we need policies that support the development of these renewable energy sources.
It's a huge challenge for sure, but a crucial one if we want to create a future that's sustainable.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of sustainability, another area that's ripe for innovation is agriculture. We have to figure out how to feed a growing global population without destroying our planet in the process.
Right. I've heard a lot about vertical farming and lab-grown meat. Are those, actual solutions?
Well, vertical farming is really interesting. Basically, you're growing crops indoors, in these like stacked layers. It's a way to produce food in urban areas, which cuts down on transportation costs, uses less water. Lab-grown meat, that's another exciting possibility. You're basically cultivating meat from animal cells in a lab. Could be a more sustainable and ethical way to produce meat.
Wow. So the food we eat in the future, it could look really different from what we're used to.
That's the amazing thing about invention, isn't it? It's this constant cycle of exploration, discovery, and creativity. Who knows what's coming next?
Well said. I think this is a perfect spot to wrap up our deep dive into this incredible world of invention. From that simple wheel to the incredible power of the internet, we've seen how human ingenuity has shaped our world in countless ways.
And as we've seen throughout this journey, innovation, it never really stops. It's about pushing those boundaries, challenging assumptions, finding those creative solutions to the problems we face. It's about imagining a better future and then working to make that future a reality.
That's a message I think we can all get behind. So, to all our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe inspired you to think a little differently, and even given you some new ideas of your own. That power to invent, to create, to shape the future, it's within each and every one of us.
Absolutely. Go out there, explore what you're passionate about, embrace your creativity, and never stop asking, what if? The future is waiting to be invented.
That's a wrap on the deep dive. Thanks for joining us.